Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. I had poured nearly $92,000 into this wedding, every rose, every glass of champagne, every flicker of candlelight paid for by my hand, and yet in the heart of the Forsyth Grand Hotel, my own son seized my arm and told me I did not belong. His bride's polite smile cut sharper than any insult, treating me as though I were nothing more than an uninvited guest. In that moment, with the weight of the check pressing in my clutch and whispers already stirring among strangers, I understood they were willing to erase me while celebrating with my money, and something inside me broke free. What they did not know was that I still held the power to take back every dollar, and with it the illusion of their perfect day. Before I could answer, Pauline approached, gliding across the lobby in a wave of perfume and silk. She looked radiant, her dress fitted in elegant makeup, flawless hair swept back like a movie star. She gave me a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Oh, Mrs. Whitfield, what a surprise." Her voice was sweet but cool. "Unfortunately, we do not have the arrangements for you to be part of the ceremony today. Perhaps another time." I stared at her, then back at my son, waiting for him to contradict her, to say, of course his mother belonged here. Daniel's eyes stayed fixed on the floor. I felt heat rush to my face, not from anger, but from humiliation. Guests nearby were beginning to glance our way, sensing tension. A couple of them whispered. My throat tightened. "I see," I said softly. "Congratulations to you both." Pauline's smile widened, slightly satisfied. Daniel finally looked up, his expression unreadable, but he did not stop me as I turned away. My heels carried me back across the marble lobby toward the exit. Each step felt heavy, as if I were pushing through water. I kept my chin high, refusing to let tears fall in front of them, in front of anyone. Outside, the sunlight was blinding. The laughter and music from inside drifted faintly through the doors. I walked slowly to the curb where my cab had dropped me off, clutching my bag close. Inside the bag, the envelope shifted against my palm. I could feel the crisp edges of the check within the gift, meant to support their honeymoon, a gesture of love from a mother who had already given far more than anyone knew. I paused on the steps and let my eyes adjust. Live oaks lined the street beyond the valet stand, their limbs heavy with Spanish moss that moved slightly in the warm breeze. The scent of magnolia clung to the air. Valets jogged back and forth, opening doors, offering polite smiles that blurred into one another. One young man looked at me as if ready to help, then hesitated, reading something in my face that told him I wanted no attention at all. I gave a small nod and moved aside. A group of bridesmaids in pale green swept past me, laughing, holding their bouquets high so the blooms would not brush their dress hems. I caught a glimpse of myself in the brass trim of the revolving door. The woman looking back seemed both familiar and strange. The dress fit the hair held, the pearls lay just right against my collarbone, but the eyes were older than they had looked in my mirror at home. Older and tired and trying very hard not to break. I took a breath and counted it down the way the nurse had taught me years ago when Derek was in the hospital. In through the nose. Hold. Out through the mouth. The memory steadied me just enough to keep standing. A couple I did not know paused nearby, checking their phones for the time, then disappeared into the cool interior. A woman in a hat asked the concierge for directions. A bell rang faintly from somewhere inside the ballroom. I pictured rows of chairs, white fabric bows tied just so the aisle petaled with roses. I pictured a mother's seat empty. My fingers tightened around the envelope until the paper bent. I thought of late nights at the kitchen table running numbers for payroll of years of washing and pressing and counting coins and then dollar bills and eventually invoices with more zeros than I had ever imagined when Derek and I first opened the shop. I thought of Daniel as a boy sticky with popsicle asking if the washers could spin fast enough to make his baseball uniform clean by morning. I thought of his teenage years, the way he began to speak about my work as if it were a thing to outgrow. I thought of the day he told me he did not want me to meet his friends from the firm because we would not have much to talk about. The door behind me opened and closed. A burst of music flooded out and then cut off. A woman laughed and someone answered in a low drawl. Somewhere upstairs, a photographer would be arranging corsages, telling people to tilt their chins, reminding them to relax their shoulders. I imagined Daniel in those photos and felt a stab of longing so sharp it knocked my breath back into my chest. A car pulled up. The driver leaned his head toward me and asked if I was waiting. I shook my head. "Not yet, thank you." He tipped his cap and rolled forward. I moved to a stone bench set along the side of the drive away from the main flow of arrivals. The bench was warm from the sun. I sat and set the clutch on my lap and placed my hands on either side of it to stop the trembling. A small boy chased a pigeon across the sidewalk, his mother calling after him with a smile. The bird lifted and glided away as if bored with the whole business. I watched it rise and settle again on a low limb unconcerned. For a moment, I considered walking back in. I could have stepped through the doors and asked for Emily and told her I was proud of her and that she looked beautiful and that none of this was her fault. I could have taken my place at the very back and kept my head down and watched my son say vows I was not invited to hear, but the picture of Pauline's smile and the cool precision of her voice stopped me. I was not wanted. That truth had a clean edge. It hurt, but it was clear. My phone buzzed in my bag. I took it out and saw the home screen glow against the sunlight. Daniel's name did not appear. There were no missed calls, no messages. Habit had made me check as if some small part of me still believed he would change his mind before it was too late. I slipped the phone back into the bag and pressed the clasp shut. A valet approached and asked if I would like him to call a cab. His tone was kind, careful. I told him I would walk a bit and call one myself. He nodded and stepped away. Relief mixed with sympathy on his face, as if he were glad to have offered without being drawn into whatever scene he sensed. I stood and faced the street. The shade under the oaks looked inviting, a narrow ribbon of cool in the bright afternoon. I chose the sidewalk rather than the driveway, taking slow steps, my shoes making a softer sound on the concrete than they had on the marble inside. The hotel receded at the edge of my vision, still busy, still shining. At the corner, I stopped and looked back once. The revolving door caught the light and spun guests flowing in. A woman lifted her phone to take a picture of the facade. A line of parked cars gleamed like fish in a stream. I thought of the roses inside of champagne flutes clinking of the band starting the first song. I thought of my son standing tall and smiling for the room, and I wished him joy even as something inside me closed like a door. I adjusted the strap of my bag and felt the weight of the envelope settle again against my palm. I did not yet know what I would do with it. I only knew I would not hand it to anyone in that lobby. The air smelled of cut grass and a hint of sea salt riding up from the river. Somewhere a trolley bell chimed, and a cluster of tourists laughed the rhythm of a Saturday that belonged to other people. I crossed to the shadier side of the block and started down toward the square, letting the canopy of branches soften the heat. The sound of the hotel faded behind me until it was only a memory stitched to the edge of the afternoon. I kept walking one step and then another, the city opening its quiet to me as my breath found a steady pace and my hands finally stopped trembling. Charleston has always had a rhythm of its own, slower than the bigger cities, a mixture of ocean breeze and church bells, and the steady hum of ordinary people working. Long before I ever stood outside that hotel in Savannah, I was just a young wife and mother learning how to keep food on the table. Derek and I were 20-something when we rented a storefront on the corner of Rutledge Avenue. The sign read, "Whitfield Cleaners," in bold red letters that we painted ourselves. He installed the second-hand washers and dryers. I managed the counter, the books, and the customers who came with their shirts and tablecloths and church dresses. We worked side by side every day, our hands raw from detergent, and our heads buzzing with the sound of machines turning. It was not glamorous, but it was ours, and every week when we locked the door on Sunday afternoon, we felt a little more certain that we could make it last. Derek used to whistle when he balanced the till, and I can still hear that sound in my memory, a tune as steady as his belief in us. Daniel was born in 1983, a small boy with lungs strong enough to wake the neighbors. I remember rocking him in the back room of the shop while the dryers hummed. He grew up on the smell of starch and the clatter of hangers. Customers would bend over the counter to pinch his cheeks, telling us how lucky he was to have parents building something of their own. We believed it too. By the mid-90s, we had opened a second location, then a third. Derek was never afraid of work. He could fix a broken drum with his hands, negotiate a lease with his quiet charm, then come home and still toss a ball with Daniel in the yard. I handled the numbers, the schedules, the payroll. My life was full, sometimes exhausting, but full in the way that made me grateful at night when I lay down and felt every muscle ache with honest labor. The years blurred into each other, school plays, soccer practices, Daniel growing taller, his hair dark like his father's. He was a bright boy, quick with his studies, and I wanted him to have more than what we had scraped together. We put away money for college, drove him to campus tours, reminded him he could be anything he dreamed of. Then came the spring of 2010. Derek complained of chest pain one morning, brushed it off as indigestion, and by that evening he was gone. A heart attack sudden and merciless. One moment I was arguing with him about replacing a dryer at the Meeting Street store, and the next, I was standing in a hospital corridor staring at a doctor's solemn face. I remember the smell of disinfectant, the hollow ringing in my ears, and Daniel's stunned silence. He was 27, just starting his career, and I thought the loss might bring us closer. For a little while it did. I took over everything. 6 locations by then, employees looking to me for direction bills arriving in stacks. I woke at dawn, drove from shop to shop, signed checks until my wrist cramped. There were nights I sat at the kitchen table with invoices spread before me, whispering to Derek that I was doing my best, that I would not let what we built collapse. I did not cry often. There was no time for that. Somehow I managed. By 2016, the market was changing, bigger chains moving in, and I was tired. An offer came from a regional company that wanted all 6 stores. I signed the deal and walked away with $2.4 million more than Derek and I had ever imagined in those early days. I put most of it into safe investments with the help of a financial advisor, bought myself a modest house near the Ashley River, and drove the same old Toyota. Money was security, not a ticket to a different life. Daniel's reaction surprised me. He had been distant through his college years, embarrassed, I think, that his parents ran laundromats instead of wearing suits. After I sold the business, he called more often, asked about my health, came to visit with polished shoes and expensive ties. It took me a while to realize that what drew him back was not me, but the money he believed I now controlled. He once brought me a thick packet filled with charts and projections for a startup his friend was launching. He wanted $200,000 from me, said it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I told him no. It was too risky. He called me old-fashioned, out of touch, unwilling to see the future. I reminded him that my so-called old-fashioned ways had built something solid, something real. He did not like hearing it. Still, despite his criticism, I helped him when I thought he truly needed it. A down payment on his first condo in Atlanta, legal fees during his divorce from Emily's mother, tuition for Emily's private school when her grades began to slip, credit card bills when he spent beyond his means. I told myself that was what mothers did. The truth is, each time I wrote a check, I hoped it might stitch us closer again, but instead it seemed to widen the distance. He accepted the money with thanks so quick it sounded rehearsed, then moved on. Phone calls were brief visits, shorter still. He avoided talking about his childhood, the shop his father. He preferred to talk about colleagues, deals, promotions, things I could not quite follow. The last time I gave him money before the wedding was in 2022, when he called late at night saying he was in a bind. Something about a loan he had co-signed a payment due immediately. I wired him what he asked, $10,000, and received nothing more than a text 2 days later saying it had been handled. No explanation, no gratitude, just handled. Looking back, I should have recognized the pattern, the way love had become entangled with obligation. But love is blinding. Even as I sensed his embarrassment about me, about my work, I kept trying to prove that I was worthy, that I was not the burden he seemed to think. When he announced his engagement to Pauline in early 2024, I felt hope stir again. Maybe this was the moment for us to mend, to start fresh, to celebrate together as family. I thought of Derek, of how he would have wanted to see his son begin a new chapter. I thought of Emily, sweet Emily, with her architect's sketches and her heart so much bigger than her years. I imagined us sitting together at the reception, clinking glasses, laughing, as if none of the distance had ever grown between us. That hope was what led me to the wedding planners in Savannah, what made me sign contracts I never intended anyone else to know about, what made me decide to pay for it all without telling a soul. But on that walk away from the hotel, as the Spanish moss swayed above the sidewalk and the envelope pressed heavy in my clutch, those years of sacrifice and quiet disappointment rose in me like a tide. Every dollar I had given, every hour I had worked, every bit of myself I had poured out. It had bought me no place in my son's world, not even a seat in the back row of his wedding. I kept moving down the shaded block, my body in the present, but my mind sifting through decades, remembering the clang of washers, Derek's whistle, Daniel's laughter as a boy. It all felt very far away, as if it had belonged to someone else's life. By the time I reached the square and sat on a bench under the branches, I knew that the past had built me into someone stronger than even Daniel realized, and that strength was beginning to stir, waiting for its moment. When Daniel first called to tell me he was engaged, his voice carried the polished excitement of someone announcing a business deal. He said her name was Pauline, that she was sophisticated, well-connected, and everything he had been looking for. I listened with a mother's hope, my heart swelling, even as his words tumbled out in a way that made me feel like an afterthought. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the phone, whispering a thank you to Derek for watching over our boy. I let myself believe this wedding could be the bridge back to my son. The following week, Daniel invited me to lunch in Atlanta. It was at a sleek restaurant where the servers wore pressed black shirts and the menus were printed on heavy cream stock. He looked at ease there, suited and confident, and Pauline sat beside him with the kind of poise that made me feel clumsy. She was beautiful, I could not deny it. Her laughter was polished, her hands graceful as she lifted her wine glass. When she called her parents very generous and spoke of their plans for a perfect celebration, I kept quiet. Daniel barely glanced at me only once to ask how I was holding up since the move from Charleston. I told him I was fine. As I drove home that night, the highway lights flickering on the windshield, I thought about the kind of wedding Daniel wanted to give her, the kind of wedding that would impress her family and colleagues. I knew him well enough to understand that appearances mattered. I also knew the truth: he could not afford it. He lived beyond his means already. If this wedding was going to be what he dreamed, someone else would have to carry the weight. That night, I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. The search led me to Pearl Weddings, a boutique agency in Savannah that promised luxury events tailored to perfection. Their photos showed candlelit receptions under draped ceilings, bridal parties walking down marble staircases, champagne fountains, string quartets. I called the number the next morning and spoke to a young woman named Carrie who invited me to their office. The Pearl Weddings office sat on the top floor of a new building overlooking the river. The reception area gleamed white and gold, every surface polished. Carrie met me with a smile that seemed both practiced and genuine. She was in her late 20s with tidy hair pinned back and a clipboard that looked like an extension of her arm. She ushered me into a conference room where binders lay open on the table. We walked through every detail. The venue was the Forsyth Grand Hotel, their most exclusive partner. The package included floral design, catering, a live band, photography, decorations, everything Daniel and Pauline could possibly want. When Carrie slid the total across the table, $91,800, I did not flinch. I thought of Derek, of all our years running the cleaners, of every dollar saved with sweat and patience. I had the money. More than that, I had the will to see my son celebrated in the way he craved, even if he never acknowledged where it came from. Carrie looked at me with surprise when I told her my condition. "They must not know I am the one paying," I said. "Let Pauline and her parents believe they are footing the bill. Let Daniel think the arrangements were handled." She blinked, hesitated, and then asked carefully if I was certain. Most parents, she explained, wanted their contribution recognized. I shook my head. My son would never accept it openly. Pride is a strange thing. If he knew it was my money, he would resent me for undermining him. Carrie made a note on her clipboard. She asked me to initial beside the confidentiality clause, her pen tapping lightly as if marking the unusual nature of the request. I signed. Walking out of that office, I felt a mixture of nerves and hope. The breeze off the river caught my hair, and for a moment I imagined Derek beside me, his arm around my shoulders. I told myself I was doing the right thing, that I was smoothing the way for Daniel to step into his new life with pride intact. The weeks that followed were filled with phone calls and emails from Carrie. She confirmed the band sent proofs of the floral arrangements, updated me on menu tastings and photography schedules. I transferred deposits through my bank in Charleston, watching the numbers shift, but telling myself it was money well spent. Every time I logged out of my account, I pictured Daniel smiling at his bride under chandeliers, unaware of the quiet hand that had made it possible. At night, I sometimes wondered if I was being foolish. I would sit in the silence of my kitchen, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the space, and question whether he would ever appreciate what I had done. But then I would remember the small boy running through our backyard, his arms outstretched, calling for me to watch him. I would remember how fiercely I had promised Derek I would look after him. That promise still bound me even when Daniel seemed to have forgotten. 2 months before the date, Carrie called with a final meeting scheduled. When I arrived, the contract was ready, thick with clauses and totals. She pointed to the lines where my signature was needed. Her tone was professional, but I caught the flicker of curiosity in her eyes. She asked again softly, "Are you absolutely sure you want to remain invisible in this?" I held the pen firmly. "Yes, that is the only way." I signed my name, Maggie Whitfield, again and again until the stack was complete. Carrie gathered the papers with care and assured me everything would be flawless. I believed her. For the first time in years, I let myself imagine that Daniel might turn to me afterward, even if only briefly, and say thank you. That one word would have been worth every dollar. As I left the building, the late afternoon sun painted the sky in streaks of orange. I clutched the folder of receipts in my hand, the proof of my sacrifice. My reflection in the glass doors caught my eye. A woman older now, lines etched by decades of work and worry, but still standing tall. I walked to my car, the papers pressed against my chest, telling myself again and again that I was doing the right thing. Somewhere inside me, a quiet voice whispered that I was building a fragile hope on shaky ground, but I silenced it. I drove away from the office, believing that I had given my son a gift greater than any wedding present, a chance to shine in a world that would never know how much it cost me. The road back to Charleston stretched long and empty, the late afternoon light casting shadows across the asphalt. My hands clutched the steering wheel tighter than necessary, my knuckles pale, but I barely noticed the motion of driving. The humiliation clung to me heavier than the humid air. The laughter from the hotel lobby, Pauline's cool smile, Daniel's eyes refusing to meet mine, all replayed in fragments until I felt sick. I rolled the window down, hoping the breeze would clear my chest, but it only carried the taste of salt from the river. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun had dipped low, staining the sky a bruised purple. My little white house looked quiet and unassuming, the same as it had for years. I cut the engine and sat there staring at the porch Derek had painted the summer before he died, the boards worn now, the railing chipped. For a moment, I could not summon the strength to open the door. Going inside felt like walking into a courtroom where every picture on the wall would testify against me. Eventually, I forced myself out of the car. My shoes clicked against the pavement as I walked up the steps, fumbling with the keys. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon polish and old wood. Everything was in its place, neat, untouched, waiting. I set my clutch on the table by the door and walked into the living room. The photographs greeted me first. They lined the mantel in their frames, the story of a family frozen in time. Daniel as a boy with missing front teeth grinning at the beach. Daniel holding up a soccer trophy in high school. Daniel at his college graduation. Derek and I on either side, pride shining in our faces. I stood there staring at them until my eyes blurred. How had it come to this? I thought that the same boy who once begged me to stay at the playground for 5 more minutes now asked me to leave his wedding. Shame burned through me deeper than any wound I had felt before. It was not only the rejection, but the public nature of it, the way other guests had glanced at us, the whispers I had sensed behind their champagne glasses. It felt like being erased as his mother stripped of the right to claim him as my own. I sat down heavily in Derek's old chair, the cushions sagging in familiar ways. I pressed my palms to my knees and stared at the floor. The humiliation pressed down on me until I felt small, smaller than I had ever felt in my life. I thought of Derek, imagined him walking through the door, imagined what he might say. I whispered his name aloud, and the sound of it nearly broke me. After a while, I forced myself up, moving toward the kitchen. The quiet of the house was unbearable, so I filled the kettle, the whistle later filling the air like a kind of anchor. I poured myself tea and carried it back to the table. My laptop sat there unopened since the week before. On impulse, I lifted the lid and tapped it awake. The screen glowed, a reminder popped up in the corner, and there it was, an email from the bank. Payment notices confirmation that several of the large transfers connected to the wedding had not yet been finalized. My eyes fixed on the numbers, nearly $92,000 in total, pending, not complete. I set down my cup, my hands trembling now for a different reason. For weeks, I had carried the weight of this secret with quiet pride, convincing myself that giving Daniel the wedding of his dreams was worth any sacrifice. But as I stared at those numbers, the humiliation from the hotel still raw, a new thought pushed through the fog. Why should I fund a celebration I was not even welcome to attend? Why should I be invisible while others raised glasses on my money? A spark flared in my chest. It was not just anger, but something colder, clearer, the beginning of resolve. I leaned back in the chair, feeling the wood press into my spine, and let the idea expand. If they did not want me there, then they would not have the benefit of my silence or my money. The room seemed different as I sat there, the same pictures on the wall, the same worn carpet underfoot, but the weight had shifted. My humiliation began to turn into something sharper, something I could hold. My eyes went back to the email, to the list of vendors, the pending transactions. The power was still mine. They had no idea. I closed the laptop slowly, my fingers lingering on the lid. The kettle clicked as it cooled on the stove, the only sound in the house. I realized I was breathing differently now, slower, steadier. The shame had not vanished, but it had given way to something stronger. I rose from the table and walked back to the mantel. I picked up the photo of Daniel at his graduation. He had been so proud that day, his smile wide, his arm around my shoulder. I remembered how he had whispered thank you after the ceremony when the crowd had thinned and we were alone. That boy was still somewhere inside him, I told myself. But the man he had become needed to learn what it meant to dismiss his own mother. Holding the photo in my hand, I felt the first true calm I had known since leaving Savannah. My humiliation had been real, my heartbreak undeniable, but now there was also clarity. I did not need to scream or demand or beg for a place at his side. I already held the key to his perfect day, and he had handed me the reason to use it. I set the frame back in its place and turned off the lights. The house settled into quiet again. This time the silence did not crush me. It steadied me. Upstairs, I changed into my night clothes, folded my dress carefully, and slid it into the closet. Tomorrow would come, and with it choices to make. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me. The night air pressed warm through the open window, carrying the sound of cicadas from the yard. My mind replayed Daniel's words, Pauline's smile, the look of the guests as I walked out of the hotel. But now, alongside those memories, was the glow of the email, the reminder that everything they celebrated still depended on me. Sleep did not come easily, but when it did, it came with a strange kind of peace. I knew what needed to be done, and for the first time in a long while, the thought of acting on my own behalf did not frighten me. It felt almost like freedom. The morning light spilled across my kitchen table as I sat with the laptop open and the bank's number typed into my phone. My tea sat untouched, the steam curling upward and vanishing before I could take a sip. My heart beat slow and heavy, but not from fear. It was steadiness, the kind that comes when a choice is already made. I pressed the call button and lifted the phone to my ear. The line clicked and a familiar voice answered. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitfield. This is Richard from Charleston First Bank. How are you today?" I cleared my throat. "I need to discuss some transactions. They are connected to an event in Savannah. Several payments, nearly $92,000 in total. I want them stopped immediately." There was a pause. I could almost picture him sitting at his desk, brows knitting together. "Stopped. You mean canceled?" "Yes, canceled. Do not let another cent go out of my account." Another pause, the sound of typing in the background. I understand. Let me check what stage the payments are at. His voice was professional but carried an edge of curiosity. After a moment, he came back. Mrs. Whitfield, some of these payments were structured with deposits. Roughly 10% of the total has already been processed. Those funds are non-refundable according to the vendor contracts, but the main body of the payments, close to $80,000, is still pending. We can issue stop payment orders. There may be penalties. I do not care about penalties, I said firmly. Stop everything you can. Richard exhaled slowly, the sound of his breath carrying through the line. If you are sure. I am sure. Typing resumed rapid, efficient. I stared out the kitchen window at the quiet street, the neat hedges, the neighbor's dog sniffing in the grass. Ordinary life carried on while I dismantled the centerpiece of my son's grand illusion. All right, Richard said after a minute. I have flagged every transaction connected to Pearl Weddings and their vendors. The hotel, the catering, the florist, the band, the photography. They will receive notice by this afternoon that funds have been withheld. Good. There will be follow-up. He continued carefully. They may call you directly. There may be legal notices, and of course there are cancellation fees outlined in the contracts. Let them. Silence hung for a beat. Finally, Richard said, I have to ask, may I note a reason for these cancellations? Yes, I replied. Write this down. Because my son told me I was not invited to his wedding. Richard hesitated and then said softly, Understood. Something inside me loosened at the sound of my own words spoken aloud. It was the first time I had told another living soul what had happened. He cleared his throat. I will confirm once the stop payments are finalized. Expect an email by this evening. Thank you, Richard. Before he could hang up, I added, Every dollar I gave them, I am taking back. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am, he said, steady and respectful. Every dollar. When the call ended, I set the phone down and folded my hands on the table. My reflection in the black screen of the laptop looked back at me lined and tired, but my eyes were sharp. I had drawn a line. The rest of the morning passed in a strange calm. I vacuumed the living room, dusted the shelves, wiped down the counters, as if the routine would anchor me. Yet every few minutes I found myself glancing at the phone, waiting for the confirmation, waiting for the first ripple of consequence. By noon, I received the email. Payment stopped. Amounts listed in neat rows. Balance restored to my account. I read it 3 times, the numbers glowing like proof of my resolve. I poured myself another cup of tea this time, drinking it all the way down, the warmth steadying me. My humiliation from the day before had transformed into something unrecognizable. I was not the discarded mother standing at the curb of a grand hotel. I was the woman who held the purse strings of the entire event. The quiet stretched around me, broken only by the clock on the wall. I imagined the hotel staff receiving notice, the florist halting deliveries, the band canceling their travel. I pictured Pauline's parents looking around in confusion when nothing appeared as planned. I pictured Daniel's face when the truth reached him. It was not joy I felt, not even satisfaction, but a hard kind of justice. For years I had given in silence. Now in silence I was taking it back. I rinsed my cup, dried it, and placed it back on the shelf. The sun had shifted across the yard, filling the kitchen with sharp light. I stood there for a long moment, hands resting on the counter, knowing that I had crossed a threshold I could never return from. Whatever storm was coming, I was ready to face it. At that very hour, while I folded laundry in the quiet of my Charleston house, the ballroom of the Forsyth Grand was filling with confusion. I would only hear fragments of it later through voices shaken by anger and disbelief, but I could picture the scene as clearly as if I had been standing among them. The florist's crew had just finished setting the last of the tall arrangements when their phones buzzed with an alert from their company. The lead designer frowned, reread the message, then motioned his team to stop. One by one, the vases were lifted, the petals rustling as they were carted back toward the service hallway. Guests who had arrived early looked on, murmuring. In another corner of the hall, waiters carried trays of glassware toward the bar, only to be halted by the catering manager. He had taken a call from his office confirming that payment had been withdrawn. He rubbed the back of his neck, whispered orders, and the waiters slowly returned the glasses to their crates. The clinking rang out sharp against the vaulted ceilings, attracting more eyes. Pauline was in the bridal suite, surrounded by bridesmaids adjusting her veil, when Carrie from Pearl Weddings rushed in, clipboard pressed to her chest. Pauline laughed nervously at first, assuming it was another small crisis about flowers or photography, but Carrie's face was pale. She explained in halting words that the main sponsor of the event had rescinded funding. At first, Pauline thought she meant her father, and she shook her head, saying there must be some mistake. But when Carrie clarified when she said it had been Daniel's mother who had covered the costs, Pauline's painted lips parted in disbelief. The bridesmaids exchanged looks, the room thick with tension. Downstairs, Daniel was pulled aside by the hotel manager, a serious man in a dark suit who explained that without valid payment, the venue could not proceed with dinner service or open the bar. Daniel's voice rose, insisting there had been some mix-up. He said his in-laws had handled everything. The manager corrected him with a single sharp sentence. The contracts were signed by Maggie Whitfield. It was at that moment that Robert Redford Sr., Pauline's father, arrived with his wife. Their presence drew the attention of everyone nearby. He was tall, silver-haired, with the kind of posture that spoke of old money and influence. His wife, elegantly dressed in navy silk, carried herself with a brittle dignity. They listened as the manager repeated what he had told Daniel. Robert's face hardened. "You told us you had taken care of every expense. We trusted you," he said, his voice carrying across the marble corridor. Pauline's mother pressed a hand to her throat, her eyes widening with both shock and humiliation. Guests were beginning to notice the gathering edging closer, whispering to one another. Daniel tried to protest. He said it was all a misunderstanding, that his mother must have interfered. His words faltered under the weight of Robert's stare. Pauline appeared, then veil trembling slightly as she walked, her expression desperate. She caught her husband's arm. "What is going on?" she demanded. Carrie hovered behind her, wringing her hands, avoiding the eyes of the Redfords. The truth landed like a stone. The flowers removed the catering, halted the music silent, and now the revelation that the entire event had been funded by the very woman Daniel had turned away at the door. Pauline's breath hitched, her voice breaking as she whispered to her husband, "You lied to me. You lied to all of us." Robert's voice was measured, almost cold. "You have deceived this family, Daniel. You let us stand here in front of our friends and associates believing we were hosts, when in fact you depended on a woman you would not even allow inside." Daniel stammered, trying to explain, but no explanation was enough. The hum of gossip swelled through the lobby and into the ballroom. Phones appeared in guests' hands, some recording, others texting out the spectacle in real time. The perfect wedding had unraveled, and the collapse was visible to every eye. Pauline's eyes brimmed with tears as she looked at her husband. "The flowers are gone. The food is gone. What have you done?" He gripped her arm too tightly, hissing that they would fix it, that he would call the bank, that everything could still be salvaged. But she pulled away, staring at him as if she no longer recognized the man she had chosen. Carrie tried to calm the Redfords, offering promises of alternative arrangements, but her words were drowned out by Robert's final sentence. "You have disgraced my daughter and our family. I cannot overlook this." The silence that followed was heavier than any outburst could have been. Daniel stood rigid, face pale, sweat shining at his temples, while his new wife covered her face with her hands. The guests shifted uncomfortably, and one by one some began to leave. In my house, miles away, I felt the stillness settle in my chest. Though I was not there to witness the scene, I knew the chain of events had begun exactly as I intended. The wedding Daniel wanted to use to prove himself had become the stage for his undoing, and it was only the beginning. Later, I would learn how quickly order bled into confusion inside that room. The chandeliers still glittered as if nothing had changed, but beneath them the seams of the evening began to split. Staff who had looked effortless an hour earlier now moved in halting patterns. Faces turned toward doors that led to kitchens and storerooms, listening for instructions that no one wanted to give. At the bar, a line of champagne flutes stood ready like a row of promises. A waiter adjusted one by habit, and then froze as the catering manager leaned in and spoke in a quiet, clipped tone. Hands lowered. Trays were lifted and carried back through the service corridor. The sound of crystal chiming against crystal traveled across the hush and made some guests flinch as if glass could bruise pride. In the center aisles, the florists began their retreat. 2 attendants slid their arms around towering arrangements and navigated them between chairs as carefully as nurses moving a patient. Petals brushed silk and satin. The fragrance thinned with every step toward the exit, roses fading to a trace of green stems and damp foam. A child asked why the flowers were going away, and a mother answered with a shake of the head because words were too heavy. Conversations broke into pockets. Friends leaned shoulder to shoulder and spoke behind hands. Others pretended to admire the ceiling so they would not have to meet anyone's eyes. Phones appeared as if by instinct. Some guests filmed openly, others held their screens low, the red dots blinking like small signals of danger. The perfect room turned into a stage, and the audience turned into reporters. Pauline stood near the head table with her veil shivering against her back. Makeup that had been flawless now showed the paths of tears she tried to wipe away without smudging further. Her father was a solid shape beside her jaw, set shoulders squared. He asked a question that needed no ornament. He wanted to know where the money was that had been promised. The tone alone told the room that a line had been crossed. Daniel began to answer and could not find a place to land his words. He said it was a misunderstanding. He said his mother had done something behind his back. He said it would be fixed in a moment. Excuses piled on one another and slid down a stack that could not bear weight. People who wanted to believe him could not find a reason to do it. People who had doubted him felt their suspicion confirmed and did not bother to hide it. Emily stood a few paces away in a bridesmaid dress the color of new leaves. All morning she had tried to feel light to enjoy her father's day, as if love could fill in the missing pieces. Now she watched details behave like facts. She knew her grandmother's careful hands and her quiet generosity. She knew the shape of pride when it stood in the way of truth. In a single minute, she understood that the story her father liked to tell about himself had left out the one person who had made the day possible. Music that had floated like silk before the ceremony dwindled to scattered tuning notes and then to nothing. A violinist tightened a bow and then relaxed it again as the band leader whispered that they were on hold. The bar did not open. Men checked their watches as if time could be negotiated. Women adjusted bracelets that did not need adjusting. The hotel manager appeared with the composed face of a man who has delivered bad news often enough to do it without apology. He spoke first to Daniel, then to Pauline's parents, then to the coordinator, and after each exchange, the circle of concern grew wider. Daniel strode toward the front desk with the posture of a fixer. He presented a card. The clerk ran it and shook his head with practiced regret. Daniel produced another, and then a third. Small approvals flashed and then failed when the larger authorization was requested. The clerk offered a phone number for the bank and a quiet explanation about weekend limits. Daniel's voice raised a half step, and the clerk stayed very still, a man trained to withstand tempers as if weather. Robert Redford Sr. did not step in to rescue anyone. He watched the process with a lawyer's attention and a father's anger. Linda stood near Pauline and smoothed a fold in her daughter's veil with a tenderness that could not reach what had already broken. Their friends shifted to the edges of the action and practiced neutral expressions that fooled no one. The shape of reputation moved in that room like a tide. It was already going out. Pauline turned back to Daniel with a steadiness that surprised those who knew her only as a woman of polish. She spoke low and clear. She laid out the facts as she saw them. The flowers were leaving. The food was not being served. The bar would not open. The hotel had not been paid. A mother had funded the day and had been turned from the door. Her eyes filled again, and she blinked hard to keep the tears from falling. That was the moment Daniel reached for his phone as if it were a life ring. He scrolled to my name and pressed call. The ringtone cut through the air in his ear and through the air of the room because he had forgotten to turn the volume down. People close by fell silent and listened to the nothing between rings. He waited and then tried again. His mouth moved with words only he could hear, a plea for me to fix what he had not respected. In Charleston, my phone lit on the table where I had set it face down. The vibration traveled along the wood like a small animal seeking attention. I looked at the screen and read his name and felt the old reflex rise in me. The reflex to step in. The reflex to make right. I placed my hand near the phone and did not touch it. The ring faded. The second call began, and I lifted the device and pressed the side button to send it to silence. The kitchen returned to the simple sound of the clock over the doorway. Back in Savannah, Daniel spoke into the voicemail, a tumble of urgency and anger. He told me to call the bank. He told me to reverse what I had done. He told me that everything would collapse. When he ended the message, he looked up and found a half circle of faces watching him. It is a terrible thing to be observed at the exact moment you realize you have no control. His jaw clenched. He pressed call again. This time he walked toward a side door so fewer people would hear him not being heard. Emily did not follow him. She stayed with Pauline and placed a hand on her arm. The gesture was small and steady. It said that someone in that room would choose kindness over spectacle. Pauline nodded once and held on to that simple touch as if it were a rope in rough water. Across the room, Carrie the planner spoke to the hotel manager in the professional shorthand of people who handle crises for a living. They both knew there was no solution without money. Guests began to decide. A few made eye contact with Pauline's parents and offered murmured sympathy. Others pretended to take urgent calls. A couple with long-standing ties to the Redfords whispered that they would see them at dinner next week and slipped out while the lobby was still an escape and not a gauntlet. Someone posted a vague line on a social feed about a wedding that had turned very real. Someone else wrote a private message that included the words "not paid" and "mother" and "humiliation." The manager gave a subtle signal, and the lights shifted down one notch. The chandeliers still shone, but the glare softened as if the room itself had decided to be kinder than the people who had filled it. Staff completed their careful extraction of the decorative touches. The band packed instruments with the quiet competence of professionals who had seen happy endings and abrupt endings and would see both again. Daniel re-entered the ballroom with his phone dead in his hand. The expression he wore was the one he used when a deal fell apart in a conference room, a look meant to communicate that the problem was temporary and that the solution would be found. No one believed it. He scanned the room for allies and found only witnesses. Pauline's father met his eyes and did not step forward. I opened my back door to let in a breeze that barely moved the curtains. Somewhere a neighbor's child laughed. A lawnmower murmured 3 houses over. These small sounds arranged themselves like a reminder that outside any grand room, the world remains ordinary and whole. I set the phone in a drawer and closed it gently. I stood at the sink and let my hands rest on the rim as if it were a rail on a ship and the house was carrying me forward. In Savannah, the edges of the crowd thinned. The shape of the evening had changed beyond denial. People who had worn new shoes began to limp. People who had applied perfect lipstick pressed their lips together and wished they had brought flats. The hush that follows a storm arrived even before the last gust. It carried a lesson that did not need words. Without respect, there is no celebration worth keeping. I stepped away from the sink and turned off the kitchen light. The room held the cool of late afternoon and the quiet of a decision kept. On the counter, the wrapped slice of cake I had planned to save from the reception existed only as a thought I could let go. The house felt steady under my feet. The day had taught its lesson in a language everyone present would understand. It was written in movement and absence and the unmistakable sound of a phone that was not answered. The next morning, sunlight crept across my kitchen table, landing on the phone I had tucked away the night before. I had not slept much, but the hours of darkness had been strangely steady. No pounding heart, no restless pacing. Only the ring of unanswered calls in my memory, each one proof that I had finally chosen silence over surrender. By mid-morning, the world had already begun to speak for me. Clips from the Forsyth Grand were appearing on social feeds. Someone had filmed the flowers being carried out and layered it with captions about unpaid bills. Another showed Daniel raising his voice near the hotel desk. His suit rumpled his face red, the audio catching fragments of him shouting about his mother. The posts spread quickly, comments piling up with the cruel ease of strangers. By noon, the local Savannah Chronicle had posted an article online. Wedding Fiasco at Forsyth Grand. The headline read, "The piece described an abrupt cancellation service staff removing food guests leaving in confusion. It named no family, but it took little imagination to match details. Smaller outlets repeated the story, and soon people across town were whispering about the insurance man who had promised grandeur and delivered a scandal. My house phone and cell phone rang in waves. The landline I ignored and the cell I left in the drawer where I had placed it. The vibration hummed against wood, persistent and unrelenting, but I walked past it to refill my coffee and let the sound fade. Every unanswered call felt like another layer of armor sliding into place. I pictured Daniel at his office Monday morning, the looks he would receive from colleagues, the jokes whispered when he passed. The man who had worked so hard to build an image of control and refinement, now known across town as the groom who could not pay his own wedding bill. The company grapevine would carry it faster than any paper, and by the end of the week he would feel the shift in handshakes and in meetings where no one looked him square in the eye. In the stillness of my living room, I listened instead to the voices of television anchors recounting the fiasco with the same cadence they used for weather and sports. They treated it like entertainment. I thought of the faces of the staff at the hotel, the careful way they had lifted arrangements and packed food. Their dignity had outlasted the celebration. By late afternoon, my cell rang again, and this time I checked the screen. Emily's name glowed back at me. I let it ring once, twice, then lifted it to my ear. Her voice broke before her sentence was finished. "Grandma, this is a nightmare. Everyone at the hotel is talking about it. It's on the internet. My father is furious, but I want you to know I stand by you." Her words carried both strength and sorrow. She had seen more than any child should see of a parent unraveling. I closed my eyes and answered her gently. "Sweetheart, none of this is your fault. You showed kindness yesterday when no one else did. That is what I will remember." She sniffled and tried to steady herself. "He keeps saying you ruined him, but I know better. I saw how he treated you. He asked you to leave like you were nothing." I pressed the phone closer, my heart pulling tight. Sometimes the hardest truth is the one a daughter has to face about her father. "Emily," I said softly, "I took back every dollar. I did it for you." There was silence, then a gasp, then the sound of her breath catching. "For me? Yes, for you. I wanted you to have the chance he never gave himself. An education, independence, choices. That money will not vanish into a night of wine and flowers. It will become something that lasts." Her tears returned, but they were different this time, lighter somehow. "I love you, Grandma." "Thank you." When the call ended, I sat with the quiet that followed. The storm outside was loud, but inside my house the calm held firm. The phone began to buzz again soon after Daniel's name flashing across the screen. Then Pauline's, then numbers I did not recognize. I let them pass. The noise of their panic could not touch the steadiness I had finally found. That evening I stepped onto my porch. The street was bathed in the golden light of early summer. Neighbors watered lawns, children rode bicycles, the world moved forward. Across town, my son faced humiliation he had chosen for himself. But here, the magnolias opened as they always did, wide and fragrant and indifferent to scandal. I folded my arms and let the evening wrap around me. For the first time in years, I did not feel like a woman waiting for respect that never came. I felt like someone who had chosen her own dignity, and no headline could take that from me. The pounding on my front door came before the sun had fully lifted over Charleston. I looked at the clock on the stove. 7 sharp. The sound was insistent, like fists meant to rattle wood from its frame. I slipped my robe tighter and walked through the quiet house, each knock louder than the last. When I opened the door, Daniel stood there in the same wrinkled suit he had worn the day before his tie pulled loose, his eyes red as if he had not closed them all night. His hair was mussed and his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitch. He jabbed a finger toward me before I had even spoken. "You ruined my wedding," he barked. "Give the money back." He pushed past me into the entryway without waiting to be invited. The smell of stale champagne and sweat followed him in. I shut the door softly behind us and turned to face him. My voice was steady in a way I had never managed with him before. "Every dollar is gone, Daniel. It's over." He laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Don't play games with me, Mom. Call the bank. Reverse it. Pauline's parents are threatening me. My company is buzzing. Do you understand what you've done?" I stepped into the kitchen, set the kettle on the stove, and looked at him across the counter. "I understand exactly. I took back what was mine to give, and I chose to put it somewhere it could not be wasted." His face flushed crimson. "You had no right. None. That money was for my wedding, for my life." I met his glare with a calm he could not shake. "That money went into a trust for Emily. She will use it for her education, for her future." His eyes wide in rage, battling with disbelief. "You think you can just give it to her? I am her father. I will contest it. I will take you to court if I have to." I leaned against the counter, my hand warm from the kettle's steam. Alan prepared every document. "The trust is airtight. Legal binding untouchable. You cannot undo it." For the first time since stepping through my door, Daniel hesitated. His anger sputtered as the reality of the law pressed against him. He clenched his fists and paced the length of the kitchen, his shoes scuffing the tile. "You planned this," he accused. "You waited for the perfect moment to humiliate me." I shook my head. "I planned to give you a wedding you would never forget. You are the one who turned me away, Daniel. You told me I was not welcome." He slammed his palm against the counter so hard the spoon in the sugar bowl rattled. "You could have stayed quiet. You could have kept paying." I lifted the kettle and poured water into my cup. "I will not stay quiet anymore." The silence between us was filled with the sound of water pouring, the faint whistle of steam fading. He stared at me as if he did not recognize the woman standing in front of him. "You're not my mother anymore," he shouted, his voice raw. "You've destroyed everything." I held his eyes. "If refusing to be used means losing that title, then so be it." For a moment, he looked as though he might strike the table again, but instead he grabbed his coat from the chair where he had thrown it. His movements were sharp, almost frantic. He stormed toward the door, flinging it open so hard it smacked the wall. The morning light fell across his face, highlighting the exhaustion etched into every line. He glared back one last time, his voice shaking with fury. "You'll regret this." The door slammed, the glass panes rattling in their frame. I stood in the quiet that followed the house, settling into calm as if exhaling after a storm. I picked up the pieces of silence he had left scattered and set them gently back into place. The kettle ticked as it cooled. My coffee sat warm in my hands. Outside, the street carried on as if nothing had changed. Neighbors walked their dogs. Birds moved between branches, the world steady in its rhythm. I knew Daniel's threats would not end at my door. He would call rage, perhaps try to twist the story at his company or among his friends, but the truth was now set in ink and law. The trust belonged to Emily. The money would build something lasting instead of vanishing into spectacle. I sat at the table, sipping slowly, letting the warmth travel through me. His words lingered sharp and cruel, but they did not pierce the armor of choice I had finally built. The day stretched ahead, filled with possibilities I had once denied myself. For the first time in years, I felt no need to rush to fix what my son had broken. The only thing that mattered was that I had chosen differently, chosen dignity, chosen to give in a way that honored the love I still carried for my family even when it was not returned. The silence of the house held steady, not empty but whole, and I let it wrap around me as I finished my coffee and looked toward the lights spilling across the yard. That afternoon, I drove downtown to Alan's office, the documents folded neatly in my bag. The spring air was mild, the streets of Charleston alive with people walking dogs, students with backpacks, tourists pausing to take photos of historic homes. My mind was fixed on the simple weight of what I carried. It was not just paperwork. It was a decision that drew a line under the past and stretched forward into the future. Alan greeted me in the lobby with his usual calm smile. He had been Derek's attorney years ago, and when my husband passed, it was Alan who helped me navigate the endless signatures and filings that followed. Now older, with a softer voice and grayer hair, he still carried that steadiness. We sat together in a quiet room with wide windows, sunlight falling across the mahogany table. He slid the documents in front of me, pointing to each section. This trust will hold $85,000 in Emily's name. She will be the sole beneficiary. The funds can be used only for educational expenses, tuition, or professional development. No one, not even her father, can touch it. I signed slowly, each stroke of the pen more certain than the last. My hand did not tremble. The letters spelled not only my name, but also my conviction. Alan notarized each page, pressing the stamp into the paper with a finality that made me breathe easier. When it was done, he looked at me. "Maggie, you have done something powerful. This is protection. More than money, it is a declaration that her potential matters more than pride." I thanked him and walked back to my car, the papers safe in their folder. As I turned the ignition, my phone buzzed. Emily's name glowed on the screen. I answered at once. "Grandma," she said breathlessly. "Dad just told me. He said you put all the wedding money in a trust for me." "Is it true?" "It is," I told her. "I met with Alan today. It is done. The money is yours, not to spend on dresses or parties, but for your education, your independence." There was a pause on the line, and then I heard her crying softly. "Grandma, I'll never forget this. I don't know how to thank you." I leaned back in the seat and closed my eyes. "Sweetheart, the only thanks I need is to see you stand on your own 2 feet. I want you to have choices. I want you to build a life that no one can take from you." Her voice steadied as she answered, "You always believed in me even when Dad brushed me aside. I promise I will use this money for school. You know I've always dreamed of finishing my architecture degree." I smiled, picturing her as a little girl building towers from blocks, sketching houses in the margins of her notebooks. "I know, Emily, and now you will. You will finish, you will design, you will create. That is what this is for." She sniffled again, but this time there was excitement under the tears. "I'll make you proud, Grandma. I swear I will. You already have," I whispered. We talked for a while longer about her courses, her professors, the projects she wanted to tackle. I listened, soaking in the energy of her hope, the way her words tumbled out like water finally finding its path. It felt like the opposite of every conversation I had with Daniel, where silence and disapproval always hung heavy. With Emily, there was light. After we hung up, I sat quietly in the car watching people cross the street, children laughing as they tugged on their parents' hands. For so long, I had measured my worth by how well I kept Daniel satisfied, how quickly I could soothe his anger. Now, for the first time, I felt my love land in the right place. That evening, Emily came to visit. She burst into my house with her backpack slung over one shoulder, her eyes red but shining. She hugged me so tightly I could feel her heartbeat against mine. "Thank you, Grandma," she whispered into my ear. "Thank you for everything." I stroked her hair and led her to the kitchen table. "Sit down, darling. Let's talk about what comes next." She pulled out her laptop and showed me her design sketches of bridges and buildings she dreamed of bringing to life. Her hands moved quickly as she explained, her voice brimming with passion. I watched her, remembering Derek's steady pride when he used to say she had his eye for detail. "You're going to change the world with these," I told her, "and every brick you place will remind me that this money went to the right person." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'll honor you with every step I take." In that moment, the weight of humiliation from the wedding slipped further behind me. I no longer felt like a woman cast aside. I felt like a grandmother who had chosen well, who had planted a seed that would grow beyond her lifetime. When Emily left later that night, she turned at the door and said with quiet certainty, "I will make our name mean something good again." After she was gone, I sat in the silence, the trust documents filed away, the house filled with a peace I had not known in years. The future was no longer something to fear. It was something to believe in, carried forward in the hands of the one person who had never turned me away. Within 3 months, I had sold the house in Charleston. The rooms where Daniel grew up, where Derek and I once built our life, were packed into boxes and loaded onto a truck that carried away not only furniture, but decades of weight. Signing the final papers at the realtor's office felt like closing a chapter that had long since soured. I drove south with the windows down the highway, stretching ahead toward Savannah, carrying only what I wanted to keep. My new house sat on a quiet street lined with live oaks draped in Spanish moss. It was smaller, easier to manage with a broad front porch and windows that opened to let in the soft coastal air. When I unlocked the door the first time, I felt the absence of ghosts. No framed arguments on the walls, no lingering silence from nights of waiting for a phone call that never came. Only blank rooms ready to hold a new life. Martha was the first to visit. She arrived with a basket of peaches from the Saturday market and laughed as she handed them to me. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said. "Now you're one of us." We sat on the porch together that evening, slicing fruit into bowls, listening to cicadas, and watching the sky turn pink above the treetops. I realized then that friendship could still bloom even after years of feeling alone. She kept me busy. Each weekend she whisked me off to the farmer's market downtown, where stalls overflowed with fresh bread jars of honey and flowers tied in bundles. She knew everyone and introduced me as if I had always belonged. We carried bags back to my kitchen and cooked meals together, laughing over recipes that never turned out quite as planned. During the week, I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center. The first time I dipped the brush into paint, my hands trembled, but the colors spread across the paper in soft shapes that steadied me. The instructor encouraged me to keep going, and soon my evenings were filled with sketches of Magnolia's fountains and the curved benches in Forsyth Park. The act of creating, of letting color flow without apology, healed something inside me I had not realized was still broken. Martha joined me on long walks through the park. We strolled beneath the great fountain where children splashed and couples took photos, pausing often to sit and talk. She told me about her travels through Europe, about nights spent in small Spanish towns where music spilled out of every doorway. It stirred something restless in me. I wanted to see more than the streets I had lived on all my life. That is why I signed up for Spanish lessons at the community college. Twice a week, I sat in a classroom with other adults, some older, some younger, all fumbling with new words. I practiced greetings, verbs, and phrases that rolled awkwardly off my tongue, but grew smoother with repetition. My classmates laughed with me, not at me, and for once I felt like a student with a future, not just an older woman filling time. The goal that kept me going was the cruise I had booked for early 2025, a Caribbean journey Derek and I had once dreamed of but never taken. Each night I studied vocabulary, imagining myself ordering food at a small cafe in San Juan or bargaining for a scarf in a Jamaican market. The thought of it filled me with anticipation instead of fear. At 66, I was preparing for an adventure, not an ending. One afternoon, an email arrived from Emily. Attached was a photo of a model she had built for her architecture course at Georgia Tech. It was a sleek bridge design, intricate and ambitious. Beneath the photo, she had written, "Look what your trust is helping me create." Thank you, Grandma. I read it 3 times, pride swelling in me so strong it made my eyes wet. I printed the photo and taped it to the fridge where I could see it each morning. Whenever doubt crept in, whenever Daniel's last words echoed too sharply, I looked at that bridge and remembered why I had chosen as I did. Emily was building something real, not a fragile show for strangers, but a foundation for her own future. On quiet evenings, I sat on my porch with a glass of iced tea watching neighbors walk dogs and children ride bicycles down the street. For the first time in many years, I did not feel the weight of proving myself. The house I had left behind in Charleston was gone, the bitterness that lived in its walls scattered. Here in Savannah, the air smelled of salt and gardenias, and I breathed it deeply. The phone still rang sometimes. Daniel tried again, his voice left on voicemails slipping between rage and pleading, but I no longer answered. The sound of his anger could not shake me anymore. Pauline had stopped calling altogether. It did not matter. My life no longer revolved around their approval. Martha teased me one evening as we left the art class, her arms full of canvases. "You are freer now than most women half your age," she said. I laughed, but inside I knew it was true. Freedom had not come from running away. It had come from finally setting boundaries and stepping into a life that belonged only to me. That night, I placed my Spanish workbook on the table beside my watercolor pad. The house around me was simple, filled only with things I chose. The silence was not loneliness. It was space. I leaned back in my chair and let the calm of it fill me. For the first time in decades, I felt light unburdened and entirely my own. The morning light streamed through the wide windows of my Savannah home, spilling across the hardwood floors and warming the packed suitcase at my feet. I had folded each piece of clothing with care, tucked my passport into its place, and laid my Spanish workbook on top, a reminder of the journey ahead. The cruise was only days away, and for the first time in my life, the idea of leaving everything familiar behind did not scare me. It thrilled me. I stood by the mirror fastening the clasp on my necklace, a simple silver chain Derek had given me on our 20th anniversary. I touched it gently, remembering the way his eyes had lit up when he surprised me with it at dinner. I could almost hear his voice telling me I had earned joy, that life was too short to let resentment and duty choke the spirit out of living. I whispered softly into the quiet room, "I hope you would be proud of me, Derek." For years, I had carried his absence like a stone in my chest, measuring my choices against the shadow of what we had built together. Now, as the magnolia trees outside rustled in the breeze, I felt his memory less as a weight and more as a companion. He had worked beside me in those laundromats, shoulder to shoulder, and I believed he would have understood the strength it took to finally draw boundaries even with our own son. I carried my suitcase to the porch and set it near the rocking chair where I liked to sit in the evenings. Martha was due to drive me to the port in a couple of days, and she had already teased me about packing too early. But I needed the bag there in sight, proof that I was really doing this, that my life was no longer tethered to Charleston, to Daniel, to endless sacrifices. The phone rang again that afternoon. Daniel's name glowed across the screen. I let it ring. After the 6th call, I turned the phone face down and walked into the garden. The azaleas were blooming, their colors loud and unapologetic. I breathed in the scent of the earth and realized that I no longer needed to hear his anger or his excuses. His voice was not the measure of my worth. Emily called later that evening. Her voice was bright, alive with news about her architecture project. She had been chosen to present her model in front of a panel at Georgia Tech. She laughed nervously, telling me she hoped her knees would not shake too much when she spoke. I assured her that no matter how shaky her knees might be, her mind and her work would speak louder than any stumble. She told me again how grateful she was for the trust fund for the chance to reach higher. Hearing her voice steady with ambition was all the confirmation I needed that I had made the right choice. After the call, I poured myself a glass of iced tea and sat on the porch as twilight fell. The crickets began their song, and the air cooled with the promise of night. My thoughts wandered back to the chaos of that wedding, to the sting of being told to go home as if I were an intruder. For weeks, those words had played on a loop in my mind. Now they had lost their power. What mattered was what followed the decision to take back what was mine and place it where it could flourish. I thought of Daniel then, of the boy he once was running through sprinklers in the yard laughing as Derek chased him with a garden hose. I missed that boy, but the man he had become was someone I could no longer save. If he chose to see me as his enemy, I would let him. I would no longer pay the price for his pride. The house glowed softly in the lamplight as I stepped back inside. My suitcase waited by the door, my passport tucked neatly away, and the thought of boarding that ship filled me with a sense of triumph. Not the triumph of revenge alone, but of survival, of reclaiming a life that had been put on hold for too long. I walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street. Neighbors' porch lights flickered on, a dog barked in the distance, and the night settled in steady and sure. I pressed my palm against the cool glass and spoke into the stillness. I may have lost my son's respect, but I took back every dollar and my dignity. If you were in my place, would you forgive him if he came back to apologize?